So let's look now at some of the sound design elements in the song. I'm going to start with the synthesizer, so let's talk about the bass first of all. The bass is relatively simple, it has a little bit of this detuned bass effect, but instead of using detuning for the bass, because it can kind of come with some slight problems in terms of phasing, I instead opted for something called pulse width modulation inside of Diva here. And if you've not seen Diva before, these are the oscillators over here on the left. We have the filter in the middle, envelopes on the right. At the moment, we're just using oscillator 2 here, as you can see by this mix style. This is oscillator 2 in this section here. Got it set to the square or pulse wave, and I'm modulating the pulse width, which is kind of just how thick or thin the square wave is, using an LFO, so it's constantly changing. If we look in the scope here, you can kind of see how I'm changing the thickness of that shape on the left here. It would look a lot more like a square wave, but just because I've got the filter turned on, that's why it's not making much of a difference. But there's just some very, very small amounts of movement created by the LFO. And now a really great thing about Diva is it has, similar to the old Model D Moog synthesizers, it has the feedback circuit built into it, which goes out of the output of the synthesizer, normally out of the headphone output it originally was, and people were able to bring that back into the input of the filter and create this feedback loop. And this just adds a little bit of extra thickness and distortion. Then we've of course got some filter movement going on here. A little bit of resonance, and the cutoff is being controlled by envelope 1, where we have a fast attack, pretty long decay with no sustain. And I've also got the keyboard tracking turned up to about halfway. And the reason I've used envelope 1 inside of Diva here, which is also our volume envelope, by the way. So this is controlling both the volume and the filter cutoff, which you wouldn't normally do because we have envelope 2, but I'm using envelope 2 to modulate the pitch of our oscillators using this dial here. And this is because the bass sounds a little bit like an 808 bass, like a kick drum, but with that nice long tail. So to help add a little bit of punch, we're modulating the pitch with this very fast attack, fast decay, no sustain envelope. And if I turn this off, not a massive difference between the two, but it just gives it that slight extra little bit of thump. And the main reason for picking Diva is just because it has that analog feel, like that feedback circuit and the filters as well. And the bass wasn't too complicated, so it's a perfect match. Then on that sound, we've got a decapitator again, a great distortion unit. I've added a little bit of EQ here, increasing the sub of the bass by 3 dB. I should be a little bit more cautious with this, really. Should probably check it on a bigger system. That might be a little bit too much at the moment. Got a bit of compression on there. And then we've got a chorus in here. Just from listening to the reference, you can hear a little bit of the bass in the side elements of our track. And I've got the chorus turned on to about 45% here, but I've also turned on this little switch here, this high pass filter, which will high pass the chorus effect from that frequency and up. So it essentially cuts out all of the low frequencies from the widened bass sound. And then finally, as always, I've got LFO tool on here. The detune lead sound is quite a typical like super saw style of sound. So you can see in here, we've got our oscillator A. This is on the default Serum saw wave that just loads in. I've got a unison of 12. The detune is not super high because it didn't sound extremely detuned in the original track. Oscillator B here is set to the harmonic series. It's on +1 octaves, which means it's technically on the second harmonic. This is making a massive difference. You could have this on or off. It is just adding a few more mid frequencies to our sound, which are helping a little bit. We have got the noise oscillator turned on over here, but you can see the level's actually at 0, and that's because I'm using it to frequency modulate oscillator A. And this just helps provide a bit more of that detuned effect, but it's not exactly the same in terms of the result. We've got a filter on the right here, 24 dB, with the cutoff frequency being modulated by envelope 2. Got a little bit of a longer attack, 57 milliseconds, no sustain, and 800 millisecond decay there. A little bit of resonance and some drive on the filter, as well as keyboard tracking 2 in the bottom left. The volume envelope is similar to envelope 2. We've got 43 millisecond attack, which is a little bit longer. The sustain is about halfway there, just below 50% if you're using a different sustain parameter, and the decay is 1.4 seconds. And it's just so each note isn't consistently just loud. We do want a little bit of drop off in volume. In terms of processing, we've got some tube distortion, which is doing a fair bit. I did originally have a chorus in this sound, but I ended up turning it off just based on the stereo image of the original reference track. I did actually use the compressor inside of Serum, not in multiband mode, and it's just doing a little bit of gain reduction. Just going to help control the volume of the synth before we get to the processors outside. And then finally, I've got a filter on here, low pass filter, set to that maximum value of 13,200. And this is just to take off some of those very, very high frequencies because the original mix isn't super bright. The processing on this, I've got an EQ8 taking out a lot of the low, very low frequencies. And then this low shelf is doing a lot of the reduction on the low frequencies, just making it a little bit lighter. If we turn this off, we've also got a high shelf boost as well, quite a strong one, just to bring some of this region really up, this presence region. A lot of reverb, Valhalla room. You can see the mix is very high for this sound, about 50%, 5-second decay time, which is quite long. I didn't really change any of the other settings in here. A little bit of glue compression because I wanted to then control the volume of my sound, but with the reverb added. And this will give it a little bit more of a natural feel because when you record an actual real instrument in a space, you won't just get the dry signal from the guitar, for example, you'll also get a little bit of the sound of the room. So by placing this glue compressor after the reverb, I'm going to be controlling not only that original dry signal, but also the reverb tail together, giving our track a little bit more glue, as the name would suggest there. Longer attack time though, and a longish release too. The auto filter here is for some automation in this beginning section. And of course, an LFO tool as well, doing some very heavy sidechain compression. This pad over here sounds a lot like a preset on the Juno 106. I can't remember exactly what number it was though, but it was one of the lower numbers. And for that reason, I've gone for the JNO wavetable, picked the saw wave. We've got a bit of unison on there with the detune up relatively high. Got a low pass filter on with a little bit of resonance. You can see that resonant bump there, which just adds a little bit of focus to the pad. This is set to about 3000 Hertz, but we also do have the keyboard tracking turned on there. In terms of the envelopes, similar to that Juno 106 preset, I've added a little bit of an attack time, 200 milliseconds, and also quite a long release, 900 milliseconds, but full sustain. In the effects section, I've added the chorus, of course, because the Juno had that original chorus built into the synthesizer. We've also got a filter in here, taking out some of the low frequencies, and I've used a very low filter setting here. It just means it's not a very aggressive filter. It's set to 172 Hertz. Even if we bring this up, you'll hear To be honest, I probably set this a little bit higher actually looking back on it now. This was another feature inside that Juno 106. It had a high pass filter built into the synth as well as the main filter too. I've also got another cymbal sample down here, but instead of just using a crash cymbal, which again might have been used in the original, I thought it'd be a bit more interesting to use Granulator 3. Could use Granulator 2 for this as well. It's just a 909 crash cymbal loaded into Granulator. And all I've done is I've just selected a part of the cymbal here. Basically just so I can get this forever resonant cymbal sound that I can then sidechain like so. I've done a lot of filtering. There's a lot of low end noise and I've taken out a little bit of resonance at this point here, but and this is really affecting in lifting up the energy going from that first major section into the more darker minor section. I'm not going to go through exactly what I've done inside a Granulator here, but if you are interested in learning about granular synthesis and all these other synthesis types that we've talked about, then I do offer online one-to-one tuition as well, where we can go through anything you want. Go to my Instagram, go to the website, you can WhatsApp me on there, drop me a message and we can work something out for you. Okay, let's talk more about the processing on some of our sounds here. I'm going to go back to the drums. Going through the individual drum parts, most of the drums are pretty standard. I've got this punchy kick from my sample library. I've got two different claps. I've got this open hat here, which is called instrument rack, and then I've got a shorter closed hat that I used from the other one too. And as you can see when I've been clicking through these, first of all, they're all within a drum rack group. If we look inside of the session view, you basically see that I've got the punchy kick on its own, and then I've grouped all my percussion together by just shift clicking, selecting all the tracks and going to right click and hitting the group button there. I'm not going to do it again because they're already in a group, of course. And it just meant that if I wanted to, I could change the volume of all the percussion. I could add processing to them. It's just a good habit to get into. Within that percussion group, I've also got another group of claps here. So this is the clap sound. And it's made up of 4 different layers, as you can see in the bottom left here. Got the main clap, one pan to the right and one pan to the left, and then I added in this snare sample underneath too. And the reason I did this was to create a nice wide clap sample. Using processing like chorus, some delay effects like the Hass effect, for me anyway, don't personally work that well. They generally always come with some kind of side effect or artifact that makes your mix potentially sound weird when it's in mono, or it can give it an extra little layer of tone. So the way I like to counter this is by having multiple layers of claps, and I'll have one main clap, and you can see inside the instrument rack here, this column is our pan of each of those layers. This one's in the center, and these two are pan right and left. I've tried to pick claps that are very similar because you don't want an imbalance of left to right. You also want to match the volumes too, so that when you play them both together like this, they sound quite balanced. You can hear, for example, the right one might be a little bit louder than the left, so I'm just going to turn that down a bit. And then when you combine that with the clap in the middle, your clap in the middle should always be a little bit louder because that's your center focus, but now you get this nice wide clap sound without any of those artifacts. And then the snare, you just add a little bit of extra weight underneath. And on the clap, we have some EQing, really focusing around that 1K clap frequency, which is a massive part of any clap sound. I've got a little bit of reverb on here. You're being used as a short, like a very short ambient reverb, very low decay time, just to help the clap sound a little bit more natural. And then I've used my soft clipping plugin here in this 20% mix mode. just to bring some of the volume back up. It's not doing loads, that there. The kick drum has a little bit of EQ just to match the original track. I've taken out a little bit of the higher punch there. And I've also boosted at about 95 there, which is like the low mid punch of the kick. So I did also add a little bit of boost in the low end here just to match up with the bass. We also have a shaker loop underneath, which is part of the bigger drums group at the top. Now this is interesting because I basically took this shaker loop, I quantized it first of all by selecting everything and quantizing it in the menu here, but I also then added the same groove to the shaker loop that we've added to everything else, but I found that it just didn't have the right feel. It was nice. Even with all the quantizing and the groove applied, it didn't have that same swingy feel that I wanted. So this is where I ended up actually using the shaper plugin, which is in the modulator category inside of the audio effects. And I've got it set to an 1/8 note rate. So that means that this window from left to right, the length of this is an 1/8 note. Now I could have made this a 16th note rate. Now the problem with that is that we wouldn't be able to apply swing to the second 16th note. So I set this to an 1/8 note rate, and I've just split the shape into 2 parts here. And this shape is simply controlling the gain of this utility to the right, you can see here. It's set to 25%, maximum of 50%, which is very important. That 50% is 0, that line there. And so it's just controlling the volume of our sound. Now, because I've got this split into 2 halves, you can see the shapes are very similar, but because I've got it set to 1/8 notes, I've been able to delay that second 16th note within that whole 1/8 note section to recreate the swing. I'll play this just so you can hear what's going on. Turn this back on. That's kind of your standard setting. You can hear, hopefully, when I move that across. Now it's adding in the swing just by manipulating the shape there. And that is doing a massive amount for that shaker loop. Bit of EQ. Reducing some of those resonant frequencies in there. Sidechain compression here, I just did it using the compressor. A little bit of redux. And this is reducing the sample rate and the bits here, but the most important part here is the jitter. And this is just helping provide that noisy tone. And obviously it's creating this noise like across the frequency spectrum, so then I had to EQ it again. Let's talk about the drum bus then. And for the drum bus, I actually end up using drum bus in Ableton. Comes with, I think, just the suite version of Ableton. I'll put it on the screen now, which one it's in. This does a lot of stuff inside this drum bus here. Saturation, distortion, compression. If I turn it off, then I normally end up setting it to this medium setting. A little bit of drive here. This damp's always set on by default, usually a little bit lower than this. I normally turn it up to, as you can see, 13 kilohertz. I'm not using the boom setting because it can be a little bit dangerous, but I am using the compression, and I've turned the trim down just so it's not compressing too much. And then I've also turned up the transients here to emphasize the punch on our transients. But what I've also done is I've brought the dry wet down because it can be a little bit too heavy sometimes with this set to 100. After this, I've got the soft clipping plugin again. And all that is doing is it's bringing up that perceived volume, taming some of the very loud sections of my drums. This little red LED in the top left corner here is telling us when it's actually clipping. mainly hitting on those big claps when they line up with the kicks, and the 2 auto filters are for automation in the song. I also want to talk a little bit about the sample processing. There's a lot of stuff going on here. To be honest, it was to just try and match this sample with the original sample in the track. I'm not going to go through it all completely. I'm just going to focus on some interesting things. One of the interesting parts of whenever you're using any kind of sample, you may find that the combined stereo effect of the sample can create some weird phase issues. So this audio file here, for example, on the actual track, I've got this utility plugin and I've got it set underneath to the mode of left. And all this does is it says ignore the right channel of the audio file. I'm just going to play the left channel out of both the speakers. If I turn this off, you can hear the sound becomes a little bit wider overall, and because it is a nice wide guitar sample, but when I was listening trying to match it with the original, I found that this gave me a little bit of a better result. If I change this to right, for example, you'll hear the tone will change. You hear that right side has a little bit of wobble or something going on, which I didn't really like, and hear that that left side is a lot stronger, and that's why I ended up picking it like this. It's very useful for samples that you've downloaded online. If you find that they have a lot of stereo information, if you do have problems between the phase of the left and the right channels, something's out of phase, for example, and sounds weird, if you hit the mono button, it's just going to combine those two together. You'll end up creating the problem that you originally trying to avoid by combining the left and the right channels together. And let me just set this up so you can hear what I'm talking about. So this is with the utility set to mono, combining the left and the right channels and then playing them both, that combined signal out of the left and the right speakers. And then the one on the right, of course, is just the left channel on its own. I'm going to press the number 2 and you'll see it'll jump back and forth between them. And you can hear this combined mono, you do get a few more higher frequencies, but the tail of the actual chord, it has that slight wobble to it, which is what I was trying to avoid. Let's look at the group now. The group has, again, loads and loads of processing to try and just help it sound like the original. The main points in this, though, is this Fresh Air plugin, which is free by Slate Digital. I think it's still free anyway. This is adding a lot of high frequencies to the sample. Very nice. Added a little bit of reverb here just because it sounded a bit dry. And I've got it set to the convolution here, made for drums, large gate snare. Another EQ. To focus a little bit more on that middle section there, probably bring that down a tiny bit. I've got a soothe on here as well, just calming some of the very high frequencies that were becoming a bit sharp. We listen to the delta on this, which is just the reduced frequencies. Helps give it a bit of a smoother top end, which helps it blend in the mix a bit better. A little bit of compression. And then we've got automation, filter, and sidechain, which isn't as harsh as some of the other instruments. It's a really great song. It has a really nice uplifting summery feel, mainly because of that major key. Really great use of the sample, and the composition is simple but really effective. Let me know down in the comments any tracks that you'd like to look at next in terms of breaking down. There is a sale on all online one-to-one courses at the moment. You've got 25% off until the 2nd of September. Drop a comment down below if you're interested, or you can get in touch on Instagram, WhatsApp, on the website too. All of the presets and samples that can be given away will be in the description of the video below. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.